For those of you unfamiliar with Prime Glyphs, they're a special type of glyph that greatly enhances a player's abilities, usually even more so than major glyphs. Prime Glyphs only lasted for one expansion, which was Cataclysm. In total, there were 80 or so Prime Glyphs throughout Cata, so today we're going to go over the best of these. And at number 10, we have the Glyph of Swiftmend. The Swiftmend ability has been around since vanilla, where it originally healed a player by consuming a stack of regrowth or rejuvenation that the druid had already placed on the player in order to heal them for the full amount immediately. This mechanic is important to understand not only the history of the Swiftmend ability, but also how the Glyph of Swiftmend affects the Swiftmend ability itself. The Glyph of Swiftmend basically just made it so it no longer removed the regrowth or rejuvenation, meaning that the druid could instantly heal the target for a ton and not have to reapply the hot afterwards. This unexpected surprise was a welcome one, and it became such a staple in druid healing rotations in Cata with the glyph that Blizzard eventually kept this new iteration of Swiftmend in the game with the talent revamps in Mists of Pandaria. So even though the Glyph of Swiftmend was removed in MoP, the new Swiftmend ability in MoP still had the same function as it did with the glyph in Cata. From Mists of Pandaria until Dragonflight, Swiftmend would not consume the hot to heal. This was finally changed back to requiring the player to consume regrowth or rejuvenation back on them in Dragonflight, as Blizzard returned to the old talent system and brought back many of the original talents, including Swiftmend in its original form, pre-Glyph of Swiftmend. In summary, the Glyph of Swiftmend is important because it shows how much Prime Glyphs influenced abilities, and how they often significantly alter the flow and feeling of the game and game mechanics themselves. Ultimately, however, the Glyph of Swiftmend, although it is powerful, only reduced the need for one spell to be cast, so comparatively overall it comes up short on many of the other upcoming entries on this list, and as such only lands at number 10. And at number 9, we have the Glyph of Raised Dead. This glyph affects the Death Knight ability Raised Dead, which is an ability that raises a ghoul to fight alongside the Death Knight. In game, these mobs are called Risen Ally, and there are actually 2 types of them depending on the Death Knight specialization. The Raised Dead ability for Blood Elves and Frost Death Knights only has the Risen Ally last for a short duration, much like a Shaman's Earth Elemental. For DKs in the Unholy spec, a Risen Ally actually becomes a controllable pet similar to a Hunter and Warlock minion. So what does the Prime Glyph of Raised Dead actually do? Well, it's pretty simple and effective. It raises the Risen Ally stamina and stats by 40%. This is not a baseline 40% increase, but instead scales with the player's own stamina and strength stats. The Glyph of Raised Dead is a permanent buff to any of the DK's ghouls. This concept is not novel to the glyph, however, since even in Wrath, some hunter pets have the ability to buff themselves too. There are actually 2 glyphs named Glyph of Raised Dead. The other glyph is a minor glyph from Wrath that eliminates the use of one of the needed reagents. The second glyph, which is the one we'll focus on, was a prime glyph introduced in Cataclysm. When Cataclysm launched, the old minor glyph was removed from the game entirely and replaced with the Glyph of Raised Ally. In Wrath, the original iteration of what became the prime glyph in Cataclysm was a major glyph called Glyph of the Ghoul, which remained unchanged when it became a prime glyph in Cataclysm. That is, its stamina and strength stats were increased by 40%. Overall, the prime Glyph of Raised Dead made the ghoul a lot more powerful of an ally in combat, buffing their stamina and strength stats by almost half. The prime Glyph of Raised Dead from the Cataclysm expansion is certainly a helpful addition to any Death Knight's arsenal, but at the end of the day, it is ultimately just a simple buff on a pet that wasn't ever designed to do too much damage in the first place. And at number 8, we have the Glyph of Rune Strike. This glyph increased the crit chance of Rune Strike by 10%. If you haven't noticed by now, most glyphs are a bit lacking in the name department. This glyph is also a major glyph in Wrath of the Lich King, which simply converted into a prime glyph in Cata. Now, a 10% crit increase might not sound like much, until you compare it to something like Glyph of Explosive Shot, which simply increased the ability's crit by 4% and was considered an SV Hunter's best glyph to take by far. When it comes to crit increases, 10% is a huge number. In addition to its high damage output, Runic Strike also generated a large amount of threat, which is why it was so frequently used by Blood Death Knights. Threat is a measure of how likely an enemy is to attack you, and it's important for tanks to generate as much threat as possible, so they can keep the enemies focused on them. And at number 7, we have the Glyph of Mage Armor. The glyph augmented the Mage Armor ability by increasing its mana regen by 20%. For those of you unfamiliar with the Mage Armor ability, it's a buff the mage can give themselves, somewhat similar to Arcane Intellect. The Arcane Armor ability has been around since patch 1.3, and all the way up until Cataclysm, it increased the mage's resistance to magic attacks, as well as allowing them to regen mana while casting. In Cataclysm, the Mage Armor buff had 3 different components. First, it regenerated 3% of the mage's mana every 5 seconds. When combined with the glyph, this upped the mana regen to 3.6%. While a small increase, even a little buff is better than no buff. Because mana was so vital to arcane mages in Cataclysm that Blizzard even had to eventually nerf mana trinkets to not work with arcane mages, so arcane mages would stop rolling on healing trinkets. Second, the Glyph of Mage Armor increased all magic resistances by a scalable number. In fact, the other two mage specs would usually only swap to Mage Armor in PvP for the magic reduction component because it was just so useful. Third, and finally, this glyph reduced the duration of harmful magical dots by 35%. Cataclysm saw Blizzard try to reduce mana problems for DPS players, which is a trend that really took off in Cataclysm, with the exception of arcane mages. In modern WoW, which is Dragonflight as of writing this video, mana regen is hardly anything to worry about most of the time for a DPS class. The Glyph of Mage Armor, while not wholly impressive with a simple mana regen buff, does highlight the shift that Blizzard made in Cataclysm for players to start having to worry less about the resources to use. This forever altered the way the game plays and feels, as the core mechanic was either gutted or lifted, depending on your opinion. The mage armors were all removed in Legion and replaced by magic barriers. For fire mages, the blazing barrier, for frost, the ice barrier, and for arcane, the prismatic barrier. However, these barriers are not quite the same and lack many features of the original mage armors. And at number 6, we have the Glyph of Berserk, which extended a powerful buff to a druid player for an additional 10 seconds. The ability Berserk, which is just a feral druid talent, has been in the game since vanilla, and while it may have seen many changes and iterations over the years, its main effect is that it has always given a temporary buff to the player. The Glyph of Berserk was added to the game in Wrath as a major glyph and only extended the duration of the ability by 5 seconds. In Cataclysm, the glyph was changed to a Prime Glyph, but it wasn't until patch 4.2 when the glyph had the duration extended up from 5 seconds to 10 seconds. In Cataclysm, the Berserk ability allowed Mangle to hit up to 3 additional targets, as well as for Mangle to have no cooldown. Additionally, when Berserk was active, the cost of all other cat abilities was reduced by 50%. This unmodified aura lasts for 15 seconds, and so with the Glyph of Berserk, this was increased to 25 seconds. As you can imagine, this provided for an insane burst in DPS and AoE damage, and was particularly useful in raiding and PvP. In fact, it was so good, it was almost mandatory for most feral druids in Cata because the buff it provided was just so strong. A 10-second extended duration may not seem like much, but because so much of feral damage is in quick, short bursts, it made those sneaky cats that much harder to kill, especially in PvP, where a very strong cat could just sneak up on a player, stun them, and then literally shred them to bits. The 25-second duration with the glyph's extension of a 3-minute cooldown also meant feral druids only had to wait a little over 2.5 minutes before they can get away with it again. And at number 5, we have another powerful entry with the Glyph of Prayer of Healing. The Prayer of Healing ability is a priest ability that's been around since vanilla. It's always had a hard cap of 5 players, and while initially it was a baseline ability, it was changed so that only holy priests could use the ability in Legion. In Cataclysm, the Prayer of Healing ability healed everyone in the player's party by a baseline amount, depending on the player's spell power. And all the glyph did was add an extra 20% healing to basically the only AoE heal that priests had at the time, in the way of a short 6-second hot afterwards. However, because this combination was actually good, Blizzard nerfed the Prayer of Healing spell shortly into Cata, making it 15% less effective. With the Glyph of Prayer of Healing, this ability got just a bit of an icing on top, and sometimes that sugar is enough to keep you going. In the grand scheme of things, however, a 20% extra over 6 seconds is less than 70% of the original spell healing power per second. It's a nice touch on the Prayer of Healing spell, but it was only really situationally useful, even if it was basically their only real AoE heal. It just simply didn't contribute much to their numbers, and was mostly used because all the other priest glyphs are pretty lackluster, because their baseline kit was already pretty strong. And at number 4, we have another DK glyph, this time the Glyph of Howling Blast. The Glyph of Howling Blast was added in Wrath of the Lich King as a major glyph before it became a prime glyph in Cata, and then removed in the game in MoP. The glyph is what I call a combo glyph. That is, it takes 2 abilities and combines them into one. In this case, it adds the ability Frost Fever to the Howling Blast ability, meaning whenever the Death Knight uses Howling Blast, it also instantly and automatically applies Frost Fever as well. This is a potent combination for several reasons, but to understand it fully, we need to look at each of the abilities in and of themselves. The Howling Blast ability is a pretty simple AoE spell, which does frost damage to all enemies within 10 yards of the target. In both Wrath and Cata, this spell had a 20-yard range, and originally it had a 5-second cooldown when Wrath went live, but its cooldown was extended to 8 seconds in the first major patch of Wrath. The other ability, Frost Fever, is where the fun begins. This ability not only applies a frost damaging dot to the target, but it also reduces their melee and ranged attack speed. In Cataclysm, the Frost Fever ability dealt frost damage every 3 seconds, and reduce attack speed by 20% for 21 seconds. The ability itself seems pretty strong, but when combined with an AoE spell that also gives the debuff to every target within a certain area, it becomes clear why this was almost a mandatory combination for Frost Death Knights. In fact, this ability combo with the glyph was so successful that when the Mop talent revamp came, Blizzard simply folded the Frostweaver ability into Howling Blast ability, essentially making the two abilities become one, just as the glyph had done. The Frost of Fever ability itself was removed altogether in Legion, with the Frost Fever debuff now directly incorporated into the baseline Howling Blast ability as it had been since Mop. To recap, what made the Howling Blast ability so strong with the Glyph of Howling Blast was because it could do damage, apply a dot, and weaken a number of mobs at once, making it perfect for trash and raids and flags in PvP, for example. Blizzard recognizes the glyph had such an impact on Frost Death Knight rotations that they themselves made the glyph into a new ability, which is the second time we've seen it so far in this list, after the Glyph of Swiftmend at the number 10 spot. However, unlike with the Glyph of Swiftmend, the devs did not re-separate the two abilities with the talent revamp in Dragonflight, so even Blizzard didn't want to back out on this change. Although they did realize in Cataclysm that the Glyph of Howling Blast made for an ability that is essentially a 3-1 combo, with a basic direct damage, a dot, and a slow, and so in Mop they removed the slow debuff option that was available to it, probably because they deemed it too OP. All of this piled on top of that is an AoE ability and can be applied to many different targets at once, makes it a very cool and OP ability indeed, and it traces all back to this glyph. And at number 3, we have a two-way tie between two glyphs that have a chance to instantly reset abilities. Both of these abilities are essentially the class's equivalent of the Warrior's Execute ability. First up is the Glyph of Killshot, which modifies the Hunter ability, Killshot. The Killshot ability is an ability used on low health foes to quickly finish them off, as the name implies. In Cataclysm, Killshot did 150% of the Hunter's weapon damage plus a percentage of their range attack power. However, this ability was also only usable on targets with less than 20% health. Enter the Glyph of Killshot, which instantly resets the cooldown of Killshot if the target fails to die. This essentially gave Hunters 2 kill shots in a row. Any more in quick succession was not possible since the glyph's effect had a 6-second cooldown. The next glyph that reset an execute-like ability is for Warlocks. The ability in question is called Shadowburn, which is a strong spell that deals a burst of shadow damage. As an interesting aside, it wasn't until patch 4.3 that the shadow damage was finally changed into Shadow Flame damage, to match its ability name. Anyway, while the Shadowburn ability can only be used on targets with 20% or less health, it provides a great boon for Warlocks because any target killed with Shadowburn instantly gives a Warlock 3 soul shards, which are one of the primary resources for the class. With the Glyph of Shadowburn, which has the same effect as the Glyph of Killshot, if the target of the Warlock fails to die from the first Shadowburn, Shadowburn's cooldown will instantly reset. This was sort of a bad luck protection mechanism in case the first Shadowburn wasn't strong enough or didn't crit enough, or if you were just fighting a raid boss who lives for quite a while under 20% health. However, it also shared the 6-second reset cooldown just like the Glyph of Killshot did. Additionally, it was so overpowered that Blizzard immediately nerfed its damage by 12% shortly into Cataclysm. Still, having 2 execute abilities is a strong combat advantage, and it's easy to see why these abilities were so overpowered. Both the Hunter's Killshot and the Warrior's Execute would later see iterations of this glyph in various talents, with the abilities being allowed to be used multiple times in succession. Both the Glyph of Killshot and Glyph of Shadowburn set the precedent for multiple executes and essentially doubled the chance to kill a low health enemy, and that in itself is the main reason why they land at number 3 on this list. And at number 2, we have 2 glyphs that increase the damage of the abilities they modify by 30%. While there are a lot of Prime Glyphs that modify damage, these 2 are the biggest percentage increases, with an increase of almost 1/3. First up is the Death Knight's Glyph of Heartstrike. The Cataclysm version of this ability would hit the target and 2 nearby ones, with the 2 cleave targets taking less damage, and also did 15% more damage for each disease on the target. With a crit or 2, this could easily take 5% off the player's health of 150,000 in early Cataclysm. The other glyph in this spot is the Glyph of Insect Swarm. This glyph also increased the damage of an ability by 30%, but this time for the Druid's ability, Insect Swarm. This ability is a simple dot that lasted for 12 seconds, dealing damage every 2 seconds instead of every 3 seconds. The Glyph of Insect Swarm therefore also increased the damage of each tick by 30%, making it one of the best glyphs to have for boomies in Cata. As mentioned, there are many glyphs that increase the DPS of abilities, but the Glyph of Heartstrike and the Glyph of Insect Swarm simply gave a higher number than the others, and sounds more impressive, even if the overall damage was less than something like a 4% crit increase from the Glyph of Explosive Shot. And finally, at number 1, we have the Glyph of Divine Favor. The Paladin ability Divine Favor has seen several iterations throughout the life of WoW. In Cataclysm, it provided a buff. Specifically, it increased the Paladin's spell casting haste by 20% and spell critical chance by 20% for 20 seconds on a 3-minute cooldown. The Glyph of Divine Favor added 10 seconds to that duration, bringing it to a total length of 30 seconds. This meant, assuming the ability was spammed immediately every 3 minutes, the Paladin had a 20% cast speed increase and 20% spell crit chance for 30 seconds every 2.5 minutes. While 20% may not seem like a lot, remember that this lasted for 30 seconds. And a lot of spells can be cast in that little amount of time. It was so good, in fact, Paladins basically had to be balanced around this 30-second window, and a lot of their spells directly interacted with it. That outside of Divine Favor windows, you could basically ignore a Paladin PvP because they'd hit you like a wet noodle. But since it lasted an insane 30 seconds, it was really hard to ignore a Paladin during this duration. The simple 10-second increase is really deceptively long, because at first glance, it doesn't sound like much until you realize it basically made their God mode cooldown last 50% longer. Well, that's a wrap on this video. There's 3 things I want to mention before the video ends though. First, we have 4 honorable mentions. The first is the Glyph of Bladestorm, which reduced the warrior's Bladestorm cooldown by 15 seconds. Second is the Glyph of Corruption, which had a chance to instantly reset the Warlock Knot. Third is the Glyph of Moonfire, which increased the Boom's ability by 20%. Finally is the Glyph of Obliterate, which increased the Death Knight's ability by 25%. This second part of the outro is about the ramifications of Prime Glyphs. While we did mention a few times how they later reappeared as talents, and in some cases they even reappeared as artifact traits, Azerite traits, anima powers, and more. However, Prime Glyphs did in some ways start the trend of borrowed power, as the best Prime Glyphs were often mandatory for some classes and specs, and then immediately in the next expansion, which was MoP, they were all removed. Granted, Mist of Pandaria did bring a major overhaul to the talent system, but Prime Glyphs represented a proto-borrowed power system in a sense.